Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Mexican Grand Prix. So welcome to the race rating series, this time out in Mexico at the Autodromo Hermanes Rodriguez. Throughout this video, just taking a look at how the drivers have done throughout the race, how their performances have stacked up compared to, say, their teammates, and just an overall pretty chilled look at the race as a whole. Now, before we get into it, do make sure that if you're enjoying the video to give it a thumbs up, and make sure you subscribe down below for more F1 content. Now, with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with your result, and it is Max Verstappen, P1, taking the win, and it was pretty comfortable in the end, to be honest. Hamilton there in P2, managing to hold off Sergio Perez, who was on the medium tyres compared to Hamilton's hard for most of the race, ahead of George Russell then in 4th, who also got the fastest lap after pinning for softs near the end. In behind, Carlos Sainz leads the Ferraris, who were absolutely nowhere pace-wise, to be honest, so then that's Leclerc down in 6th, and then Daniel Ricciardo best of the rest, in what has actually kind of become a bit of a rare great performance for him. In behind, Esteban Ocon, who separates the McLarens with Norris down in 9th, and then Valtteri Bottas picking up a single point for Alfa Romeo, which I'm pretty sure matches their entire total for the second half of the season. Now, talking a bit about the race itself, and let's cut straight to it, let's be honest, not the best we've had this year. I'd argue possibly the worst race we've had this year, actually. Taking a look at what went on though, and lap 1 was pretty interesting. We had some battling between the Mercedes and Perez. You know, you had sort of Hamilton and Russell, with Hamilton getting through, Russell then losing out to Perez down into turn 4 as well. However, after that, it sort of very quickly settled into just sort of tyre management and people not really able to pass too easily. There were a few people a little bit further back who were able to make some moves. You know, I'm thinking of Daniel Ricciardo. Again, he had a pretty decent race and was making a couple of moves earlier on. I think it was a move on Joe on lap maybe 9. Not too much after that until we had the Gasly-Stroll incident where Pierre forced his way through and also forced Stroll off of the track, which earned him a 5-second penalty, and I'm pretty sure most people watching that could very quickly, almost instantly say, yep, that's a 5-second penalty if he doesn't give it back. I kind of feel like Gasly at the time and Alphatauri at the time went, to be honest, we might lose more than 5 seconds if we're still stuck behind Stroll, and so just carried on. However, it does put Gasly in a bit more danger when it comes to penalty points. You know, he's already getting up towards that 12 for a race ban, and I'm pretty sure if this gets him another one, he's going to be really close, like just 1 or 2 away. Back into the race though, and a little bit later on, we came to the pit stop. So it was Sergio Perez who was first in, and with a slow stop, I think it was 5 point something seconds stationary, so maybe an extra 3 seconds or so, didn't really help his race out, especially when you consider how close he was to Hamilton during that second stint. Talking of Mercedes, and given they started on the mediums, they went a bit longer than the Red Bulls. However, it was only sort of like 6 to 8 laps longer. They didn't do too much further on those medium tyres compared to the softs. And changing off of those mediums, they went onto the hard tyres, which just didn't really work. And ultimately, I think if they had a similar strategy, especially with Hamilton to Verstappen, going soft-medium or medium-soft, it definitely would have been a bit more interesting and a lot closer come the end of the race. However, with those hard tyres, it did mean that Sergio Perez was able to run pretty closely to Hamilton for a lot of it actually, often finding himself just outside of that 1 second DRS range, which meant that he was never quite close enough to properly be able to make a move or try and get past. Further down though, there were some battles going on. I'm thinking of the likes of Vettel and Zhou, that was a fun one to watch. And then of course we had Daniel Ricciardo trying to get past Yuki Tsunoda, and the two coming together around that sort of double apex right-handed hairpin. Ricciardo, I think, just a bit too eager there, going up the inside, and you think when you put your car in that position, you have to just hope that Tsunoda doesn't turn in, but as he did, that instant's always going to be on Ricciardo, you know, just a little bit too eager. The 10 seconds he got, maybe a little bit harsh, but in the end didn't alter the position and didn't matter too much. Fast forwarding ahead, because, well, not too much was going on, and we had Fernando Alonso's car dying, which, considering how close the battle is with McLaren, it might be pretty big for them come the end of the season. That brought out a virtual safety car as opposed to a full safety car with a few laps to go, and I feel like that just kind of sums up the race really. You know, we could have got a bit of action at the end, but on the whole, the race just didn't really deliver it. On to some ratings now, starting off with the poll from YouTube as always, and as you might expect, a few lower selections this time round, you guys giving it a 4.4. Now I haven't gone back and checked some of the past races, but I'm pretty sure this has to be one of the lowest that we've had, and understandably so. When it comes to my rating, I've actually gone slightly lower with a 3.5, and it's because I think this has kind of been clear-cut one of the worst races of the season. There were a couple of battles in there, sort of towards the midfield is more what I'm thinking of, and maybe a little bit of the strategy, mediums and hard, softs, mediums, etc. But on the whole, there just wasn't too much going on, and not really enough to give it anything higher. Maybe, if we'd seen the Mercedes cars on a better strategy, going from mediums to softs at the ends and then closing up to the Red Bulls, it would have been much more interesting, and potentially battles for the lead or the podium places, but as it was, that just didn't happen. On to teams then, and starting with Haas, who have honestly had just a really disappointing race. They never looked to have any pace at all, and spent the entire time near, if not at the back of the pack. So for drivers in Mexico, I'm going to begin with Mick Schumacher, and I'm not going to lie, it's actually kind of a tricky one to do a rating on, simply because he didn't have much to do. The Haas car just was so terrible this weekend. I guess for Mick, you can say he started on the softs and kept it clean during the beginning, was ahead of his teammate for the entire race, did manage to undercut Stroll when he swapped onto mediums, but then Stroll came back past. At the end of it all, finished about 1.5 to 2 seconds ahead of his teammate, which I guess is pretty good. But really, the Haas guys, their race was determined by the fact that the car just didn't really have any pace. In that first stint, his closest car around him was actually Nicholas Latifi. So I guess for a rating for Mick, it's probably going to be a 5.5, which is what my average is. He's not really done anything wrong, not done anything too amazing, but it's mostly on the car. Then we have Kevin Magnussen and his race at Mexico. Like his teammate, hampered by the fact that the car just seemed to have absolutely no pace this weekend, which was something we saw for a couple of teams. We'll get to Ferrari later on, but compared to where they usually are, their car was nowhere. For Magnussen, however, did the opposite to his teammate, so went from the mediums and then swapped onto the softs later on, and then finished about 1.5 to 2 seconds behind Mick Schumacher. Was actually running behind Nicholas Latifi earlier on, even though Latifi was on the softs and Magnussen on the mediums, and he did eventually make his way past. So rating wise for Magnussen, again like Schumacher, there's really not too much to go on, so I think it's probably going to be a 5, only half a mark down on his teammate simply because he finished just over a second or so behind, and that's just all I've really got to go on. Next up we have Aston Martin, and I've got to say, considering the form that they had coming into this race and the amount of points that they scored over the last few, this one's got to go down as disappointing. Ultimately they finished 14th and 15th and not picked up any points whatsoever. So taking a look at Sebastian Vettel and his race, his Mexican Grand Prix, and there's one thing that stands out more than anything else, and that's the fact that he started on the soft tyres and took them about 39 laps into the race. And when you consider the likes of Perez and Verstappen went sort of 24, 26 laps or so, to go 39 laps, that's over half the distance, and then swap onto the medium tyres is an incredible feat. It was an absolute tyre whisperer at the Mexican Grand Prix. The issue he had then was he had medium tyres later on for roughly the same age as a lot of people on soft tyres, which meant that further into the race he was overtaken by the likes of Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly. He had a nice battle with Joe, but lost out on that one too. The way I'd kind of sum it up is the race pace wasn't the best, but managing those tyres for 39 laps has to count for something. And so for Seb, his rating is going to be a 7. Again, the race pace wasn't incredible, mostly due to the Aston Martin, but that first stint on its own is worth something. So now Lance Stroll and his race. He actually got the best start out of anyone in terms of both the start and lap 1 as a whole, starting P20 but ending up 5 places higher up by the end of lap 1 in P15. Then on that first stint, started on the mediums and found himself slowly dropping away from people like teammate Sebastian Vettel up ahead who were on the soft tyres. Actually pitted fairly early on off of the mediums and onto softs, before making a second stop later on onto soft tyres, and running 2 sets of softs, being able to push kind of works how you would expect, in the sense of gets onto the softs, makes some progress, gets past some people, stops again, has to get past people again. And unfortunately for Stroll, the only person he overtook on his second set of soft tyres was Kevin Magnussen, who was running almost basically last. I think in this one the 2-stop strategy really hasn't helped Stroll, but also his pace didn't look amazing, especially when you compare it to his teammate Sebastian Vettel and what he was kind of able to do. They've only finished 1 place apart, but Stroll was around 8 seconds behind him. I guess he did lose a little bit of time earlier on, getting pushed wide by Gasly, and maybe that would have changed his race a little bit. So rating wise for Stroll, I think it'll be a 5.5, just pretty average. Next up we have Williams, and unfortunately for them, at a track which has one of the longest straights and flat out sections on the calendar, weren't quite fully able to utilise that car's straight line speed to pick up any points in this one, with Albon finishing in 12th as their best finisher. Starting with Albon's race then, and it wasn't the best start actually. Started the race in 17th but was back down to 19th on the opening lap alongside his teammate Latifi behind him in 20th. From there though, was making sort of steady progress, got past both Haas cars and was up to the back of Gasly for a bit when he was battling Stroll, however then sort of stalled out and dropped back a couple of seconds from the Alphatauri and the Aston Martin. Pitted later on in the race around lap 46 or so, moving from his medium tyres onto softs for the remaining stint, got past the likes of Sebastian Vettel and was actually making decent progress, and with 3 laps to go was sat in P11, just one spot away from the points. So I think for Albon, when you look at his race as a whole, he's done really well. He started down in 17th, has finished in 12th, almost P11 as well, so rating wise for him, I think it's going to probably be a 7.5. Not any higher just because a couple of those cars that he's got past are the Haas's, who look to have no pace whatsoever, and the Aston Martins, who didn't look to be too great either. Now we have Nicholas Latifi, and looking back at this one, I think it almost goes down as a Latifi special, mostly due to the fact that in the opening stint he was actually doing alright. He was sort of sandwiching the Haas cars for a little bit, was in between them, was quite close to the back to Mick Schumacher but couldn't get past, and then eventually got passed by Kevin Magnussen and found himself at the back of the pack where he stayed for the entire time. And I think when it comes to Latifi, there's one stat that really sums his race up, and that's that across the finish line, he was around 52 seconds behind Kevin Magnussen, who was the car ahead of him. Yes, he has made 2 stops, he was one of only a couple of cars to make 2 stops, but still, even without that, you'd be 30 seconds behind the car ahead. So rating wise for Latifi, even by his standards, it's pretty bad. So I think it's probably going to have to be like a 1.5. It really wasn't great for him. Next up we have Alphatauri, and while their car looked, it looked okay, decently competitive for a midfield team, unfortunately for them no points, and the only potential one that they could have had was kinda taken away by Daniel Ricciardo. So for drivers, I'll begin with Tsunoda and his Mexican Grand Prix. Started on the soft tyres down in 13th place and actually made up a couple of places early on, up to P11, and found himself sat in between both McLaren cars. From there was sort of fairly comfortable. He wasn't really putting pressure on Lando, but didn't really have too much pressure from Ricciardo behind either. Admittedly, the McLarens were on the medium, so maybe that's why. Pitted then from his softs onto the mediums, and his race really came undone when Daniel Ricciardo came up behind him on nice, fresh, soft tyres. Where Ricciardo's got the soft tyres, they're alternating lines, tries to get the switch back, and Daniel just kind of sticks a nose up the inside of Tsunoda. Realistically, I think Tsunoda is far enough ahead that he should expect Daniel Ricciardo to sort of not be there, but Ricciardo really shouldn't have gone for that move. So I don't really think that's Tsunoda's fault at all, and it was really unfortunate for him because the damage he sustained from that put him out of the race. And that was a real shame considering he was a couple of seconds back from Lando Norris, and so maybe could have got a point towards the end of it. Rating wise for Tsunoda, I think it's probably going to be a 7. He had a decent start, running well pace wise, could have been on for a point and was taken out through no fault of his own. So now we have Pierre Gasly and his race. Started on the medium tyres in 14th and dropped a couple of places early on and found himself behind Lance Stroll, who he had more pace than and was so desperate to clear, he just forced his way up the inside into turn 4, had a little lock up, opened the steering and then forced Stroll off the track. And with that incident, I'm pretty sure everyone at the time looked at that and straight away went, yep, he's pushed Stroll wide there, that's going to be a penalty if he doesn't give it back. And ultimately, he didn't give the place back and got the 5-second penalty. Now, I can sort of understand from the sense that maybe they'd have lost more time behind Stroll because he did push on after that, but the big concern for him really is penalty points. That's going to be another one picked up and get him even closer to a potential race ban. Back to his racing though, and he went from the medium tyres onto softs at the end, and then made his way up from around 15th place all the way up to P11 by the end of it. So the way I see his race is first stint not great, especially with the penalty, second stint really good. So rating wise for Pierre, I think it's going to be right in the middle, probably a 5.5 for him. Ultimately, one stint wasn't too great, but the other one was pretty good on the soft tyres. Next up, Alfa Romeo, and after many races of not scoring and only having 1 point in their last 9, Valtteri Bottas has picked up another one for them, and given Aston Martin didn't score, it could prove crucial in what has become their fight for 6th place in the championship. So on to drivers, and it's Valtteri Bottas to start with. qualified way up the grid, all the way in P6, which was where he started. Did drop a couple of places early on back into 8th, where he slotted in behind Fernando Alonso, and with him on mediums and Alonso on mediums, just extended and extended and extended his stint for quite a while, happy to chill behind the Alpine and just see how far he could go. However, where it came undone was instead of swapping onto, say, softs and going a little bit even further, he swapped onto the hard tyres, was one of the last to do so, and that meant that instead of running on, say, soft tyres towards the end, he had those hards, which meant the pace just wasn't there. He came up behind Esteban Ocon and managed to keep up for quite a while and was sort of pushing onto the back of him. There were a couple of times when I thought, oh, maybe he could go for it, and because it's Valtteri, he sort of maybe just didn't. However, eventually then sort of dropped back, and guys like Daniel Ricciardo, who were on soft, got past. Did manage to pick up a point in the end, which, considering the strategy, I think is pretty good. So rating-wise for Bottas on the whole, I think it's probably going to be a 7. You know, he's had good pace on those mediums to start with, and yes, he's been on the hards, which isn't really his fault, but it would have been nice to maybe just see a little bit more from that second stint. Next up, we have Zhou Guanyu, who started in 12th place and basically maintained his position early on. Did get overtaken by Ricciardo, but when you look at the pace that McLaren had towards the end, you can sort of understand why. However, from there, didn't let anyone else pass, the likes of Sebastian Vettel behind, but did drop back from Ricciardo to the point where he was sort of 5 or 6 seconds behind when you get to all of the pit stops and things. Went from his medium tyres onto softs and was sort of in that battle with the likes of Gasly and Vettel and Albon. However, slowly just dropped off the back of the likes of Gasly and Albon to the point where he finished 13th behind both of them. I think when you look at his rating and what it'll be, I'm kind of comparing to Bottas, and Valtteri really did seem to have a grip on that Alfa Romeo, whereas Zhou just never really quite looked there. So I think rating wise it's going to be a 5. He's not done anything wrong, just maybe a little below average considering how well Valtteri drove this weekend. Next up, Alpine, who early on in the race definitely looked to have the pace over the McLarens, and it looked like they would be sort of finishing way ahead of them. However, come the end, reliability, which has kind of been a bit of an Achilles heel for them this year, came back to bite them. So on to drivers, and I'll start with Fernando Alonso and his Mexican Grand Prix, and to be honest, was leading that sort of best of the rest or having that best of the rest spot for a lot of the race. Was ahead of the likes of Valtteri, his teammate Ocon, the likes of Norris and Ricciardo as well. However, it must be said that although he was sort of at the front of that group, never really pulled away and normally had a car sort of around the DRS range just tagging along behind. Strategy wise, went from the mediums onto the hard tyres, which as we saw proved not to be the best strategy call, and actually lost out later on when Daniel Ricciardo was coming through on his softs, losing out to his teammate Ocon and then dropping back a little bit, probably having to save his engine because ultimately we saw at the end, well, it just probably overheated and he had to retire. I think rating wise for Alonso it's going to be a 6.5. I was tempted to give him a 7, but when I consider that he never really pulled away from anyone behind, it's probably just an above average drive to be leading that pack, and ultimately he's retired through no fault of his own. Next up, Esteban Ocon, who early on in the race started on the medium tyres and spent basically that entire first stint behind Valtteri Bottas, who was behind his teammate, usually about a second or maybe a couple of seconds behind the Alfa Romeo ahead. Stopped before both Alonso and Bottas and went onto the hard tyres, and then when he came out there was a stint where he was behind Alonso and was just slowly dropping back, definitely didn't quite have the pace of Alonso, and it wasn't until Fernando had those sort of engine issues towards the back end of the race that he actually started catching him up. Was opportunistic getting past, but also got passed by Daniel Ricciardo as well, but Ricciardo was on the soft tyres, so that's kind of to be expected. It would have been really hard for him to defend on the hards. I think rating wise for Ocon it's probably going to go down as a 5.5. It's a decent finishing position and an okay race, but the pace just wasn't quite there compared to Alonso, especially on those hard tyres. Next up, McLaren, and a good number of points picked up, and especially from both drivers this time, it was really nice to see both of them, including Ricciardo, actually having decent races. Driver-wise, I start off with Daniel Ricciardo, who was on the medium tyres and found himself behind Tsunoda for most of the first stint. Did get past Zhou early on, which was pretty crucial as well. He didn't want to get stuck behind the Alfa Romeo. But yeah, spent most of that first stint behind Tsunoda and got ahead when Tsunoda pitted onto medium tyres. Ricciardo, on the other hand, went really long considering he did start on the mediums and eventually swapped a set of softs at the end, and on those soft tyres the pace was really great. I would argue outside of the top 6, probably maybe even quicker than the Ferraris on those soft tyres. Obviously, a big point of note is the Tsunoda collision, where he's just a bit too eager going up the inside of that corner. It's never really on, like there is a slight gap, but it's always going to be closing, and he's never really got far enough alongside. So a penalty is definitely deserved. I think 5 or 10, either of those would have been appropriate. In the end though, it didn't matter because the pace he had on those softs and the overtakes he got done were so good. He got past both the Alpines and was best of the rest, which for Daniel Ricciardo has to go down probably as his best drive of the year. Rating wise for him, I think it's probably going to be an 8. It would be something higher like an 8.5 or maybe a 9, but that collision with Tsunoda does drop it back just a little bit. And then Lando Norris, who started off on the medium tyres and just didn't really seem to be able to do much. He sort of found himself stuck with no one really around him, not really making too much progress, but not really losing much either. Did pit onto the hard tyres, which as we saw from many drivers was not the strategy to go with, and it meant that later on in the race, Daniel Ricciardo caught up to him pretty easily on the soft, and the team actually told him to let Daniel go because he was on the softer and quicker tyres. For the rest of Lando's race, it was basically chasing down and trying to get past Valtteri Bottas, which he eventually did and then took home 9th place. What I will say is though, although he had the worst strategy out of the two McLarens, he definitely didn't look to be anywhere near as quick as he was compared to Ricciardo as we've seen over the last few races and the season in general. So I think for Lando it's probably going to have to be a 5.5. I look at his race and I just say yep, it seemed pretty average. He didn't look too quick on the mediums or on the hard tyres either. Next up, Ferrari, and honestly, pace-wise, this has to be by far their worst race of the season. They were just absolutely nowhere. They were comfortably on their own in sort of 5th and 6th place, and actually the gap between Sainz in 5th and Russell in 4th was usually pretty similar to that of Leclerc and Alonso behind, which doesn't bode well for them. Driver-wise, I'll start off with Carlos Sainz. He managed to hold off cars behind at the start of the race and maintain his 5th position. Had a nice battle with his teammate Leclerc on the opening lap where he came out ahead at the end, and then from there just sat in 5th place, slowly losing time to the Mercedes and Red Bulls ahead, and that's pretty much it. The thing I will say though is he did look to have the pace over Leclerc throughout the race, just slowly extending that gap to the point where at the end of the race it was around 8 or 9 seconds to his teammate Leclerc behind. Rating wise for Sainz, I think it probably goes down as a 6. Ultimately, the Ferrari's pace definitely wasn't there, but it's elevated as just above average simply because he was quicker than Leclerc. Next up, Charles Leclerc, and like his teammate, there's honestly very little to talk about besides lap 1, where he made up a place early on, getting past Valtteri Bottas, which was key, but I think he would have made that overtake if he had got stuck behind. Did try and get past his teammate Carlos Sainz and was ahead at one point, but wasn't able to just hold on through the sort of tight, twisty Sector 2 corners. From there was sat behind his teammate Sainz, and as I've just mentioned with Carlos, Leclerc just sort of slowly dropped back throughout the entire course of the race, eventually finishing like 8 or 9 seconds behind. It's worth mentioning as well, the two of them were on exactly the same strategy, starting on the soft tyres and then going to the mediums, which was the preferred strategy in the end to be honest, and they still finished a really far way off of the Mercedes, though I do think that was due to the Ferrari more than anything else, because we saw in qualifying the Ferrari wasn't there either. Rating wise for Leclerc, I think it goes down as a 5, where Sainz was simply just above average because of his performance compared to Leclerc. Leclerc drops just below average. Next up, Mercedes, and you've got to say this was definitely one of their better races this season, especially in terms of just outright pace in the car, probably along with the likes of say the Netherlands or maybe Hungary, in terms of just their overall pace and deficit to Red Bull ahead. Driver-wise, I'll start with Hamilton. He had a really great start and was up a place ahead of Russell. He went for that move round the outside of turn 2, then onto the inside of turn 3, maybe squeezed his teammate a little wide, but on lap 1 everyone's close, some people are going to go a little bit wide, nothing in it there, and ultimately just held onto that position, which was actually really key because it meant that he didn't have to sort of sit behind Perez and could just, keep that gap to Verstappen, and it meant that that basically got him P2 later on. Pace-wise on the mediums seemed really good, managed to keep up with Verstappen when he was on the softs at the beginning of that stint, and maintain that gap at around 1 to 2 seconds basically the entire first stint. However for him, undone by the strategy, which was on the team, he questioned the tyres a lot. He actually said in an interview afterwards he wanted to start on the soft tyres. I will say I think he did a really good job defending from Perez when he was really close, Perez on those mediums, Hamilton on the hards, making sure he didn't get in that DRS range, because honestly, if Perez did, he may well have got second, and with the Mercedes sort of straight line speed deficit, I don't think he'd have got back past. Rating wise for Hamilton, it was between an 8 and an 8.5, but I am just going to give him that 8.5 simply because, that pace on the early stint on the mediums compared to Verstappen's soft, he was able to stay within a second or two pretty comfortably, and when you consider that Red Bull is just the quicker car, it just gives him that extra half point. Next up, George Russell, who lost out a couple of places early on, which ultimately sealed his position at the end of the race. On lap 1 he lost out to teammate Hamilton, just a good little battle between those two, and also took a little bit too much curb, which got him a bad exit through turn 3, which meant that Perez was able to get past into turn 4. Pace-wise, wasn't quite on the level of his teammate. We saw him sort of dropping back just a little bit. Perez dropped back a little bit from Hamilton and Russell dropped back a little bit from Perez. This is early on the medium tyres for the Mercedes. And he also wanted to go longer and swap onto the softs at the end, which to be fair may well have worked out well, but I think from what I was hearing, the Mercedes guys sort of saw the pace was dropping off and they wouldn't be able to do it. Ultimately, that lost him a little bit of time before swapping onto the hards. However, on those hard tyres, I think the pace was a little bit better. He was sort of keeping up with Hamilton. That gap was staying about the same. However, just wasn't able to manage the tyres as well because towards the end of the race, dropped back quite a bit and eventually sort of finished 9 seconds away from his teammate. 4th place though, and being able to stop for the fastest lap, I guess, is a consolation. Rating wise for Russell though, it's probably going to have to go down as a 6. I think on the whole he's done alright, but then you look at it and say, well, he's lost 2 places earlier on and was definitely slower than his teammate, so giving him a sort of average to maybe slightly above average simply because the pace on the whole compared to Perez, he was able to keep up the whole time, was pretty decent, but yeah, only a 6 for him. Next up, Red Bull, and it's another win for them. This is now their 9th win in a row, with 8 of those going to Max Verstappen. Driver-wise, I've got to start with Sergio Perez at his home race in Mexico, and honestly for him, it was a pretty good one. Earlier on, managed to get past George Russell, which was really key, made a nice move down into turn 4 to do so. Then compared to Hamilton and Verstappen, honestly, was able to generally keep pace on the sort of his soft tyres compared to Hamilton's mediums and Verstappen's soft earlier on. Pitted a little bit earlier than Verstappen, did have a slow stop which didn't help him out, and ultimately meant that he was never going to get that undercut on Hamilton. But on those medium tyres later on, really was putting pressure onto the Mercedes driver, and actually was very close to getting in DRS range, and I think had he got into DRS range, he would have got past, and with the straight line speed that Red Bull had, may well have held on to P2 in that case. However, we did see him drop off a little bit at the end, which was kind of to be expected with those medium tyres, but on the whole for Checo, I think it's a really solid race. I would have to say throughout this one, he was much closer to Hamilton than he was to Russell behind, and you've got to consider that slow stop as well. Rating wise for Checo, it's going to go down as a 7.5, it was a pretty solid race on the whole. The reason it's not quite any higher, sort of like an 8, 8.5, is because the pace of Verstappen was definitely less, and also whereas Verstappen's tyres didn't really fade too much at the end, Perez's definitely did. And then finally, Max Verstappen, who maintained the lead into turn 1 and then held the net race lead the entire time. Also helped out by the team absolutely getting the strategy right, going from the softs onto the mediums, which meant that entire second stint when he was on mediums and Hamilton was on hards, apart from maybe a couple of laps, he was still extending that gap and ended up crossing the finish line 15 seconds ahead of Hamilton in second. Honestly, there's not really too much to fault. He managed to extend those softs really, really well, and even with the softs going up, still kept that gap to Hamilton behind. We really didn't see too much of him, and that's because, honestly, he had a really commanding race. Rating-wise, it's going to go down as a 9. It's a pretty common theme for Verstappen to be getting these ratings, but that's honestly because he did everything pretty much perfectly. Again, it's not like a 10 or something because it wasn't complete domination, driving off into the absolute distance by, say, 40 seconds or so. So there you have the race ratings for Mexico, and a number of good performances in there. Obviously Max Verstappen at the top, but someone like Daniel Ricciardo, who's really not had the best season, putting in a great race with a few races to go, but when it comes to retaining his seat, just a little bit too late. Also people like Sebastian Vettel and Valtteri Bottas having good races with Hamilton and Perez as well. Down the other end, a really bad one for Latifi. I know I've come to expect low performances from him, but even for him, this was pretty bad. Now on to the updated race rating standings, and obviously Max Verstappen still has that really commanding lead. Leclerc there in second does drop a little bit closer to the likes of Perez and Hamilton behind, who's now actually jumped ahead of Russell in the battle of the Mercedes drivers. Elsewhere though, not a ton of movement, most people having pretty consistent grades, and obviously Nicholas Latifi distances himself even further at the bottom of the pack. Anyways, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed, do make sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe for more F1 content. But until next time, take care.